Qatar is not a democracy. Migrant workers there are treated badly. Gay rights and women's rights are sorely lacking by Western standards. Sexual freedom is limited. These are all facts about Qatar. But there are also facts about Russia, which hosted the last World Cup, and there are facts about China, which staged the Winter Olympics just 9 months ago. There are controversies almost everywhere that any major sporting event takes place. Unless the World Cup rotates endlessly between Switzerland, Sweden and Finland, there's always going to be a problem. Well, today's controversy is the apparent crackdown on a handful of fans wearing rainbow hats and T-shirts in support of gay rights. Wales Ambassador Laura McAllister said this.
When we got through security, some of the security guards said that we had to take the hat off. When I asked them why, they said because it was a banned symbol and that we weren't allowed to wear it in the stadium. And I pointed out that FIFA had made lots of comments about supporting LGBT rights in this tournament.
It's a modest protest, and frankly, it's a cause that I obviously support. But what were they expecting? Qatar warned as far back as April that they'd confiscate rainbow flags, partly over concerns that local people might react angrily. And while FIFA says rainbow symbols are OK inside stadiums, they don't run the country. Qatar has opened its house to the world, and for the most part, all fans appear to be welcome. But when you're in someone else's house, it's polite to respect their rules, even if you don't agree with them. If this so-called crackdown turns nasty, I'll be the first to call it out. Right now, it looks like another version of the same argument we've been having for months, in fact years, about this Qatar World Cup. It shouldn't be left to fans to take the heat for protests when the players themselves are bottling it over the threat of a yellow card. Home advantage is already having a weird and wonderful impact, though, on the first ever Middle Eastern World Cup. Qatar's neighbours, Saudi Arabia, stunned the world today by beating hot favourites Argentina, leaving a certain Lionel Messi looking less than chuffed. England could face Argentina in the next round if they make it. So never mind respecting local customs, we might be calling them for some tactical advice. And the sight of thousands of Saudi fans celebrating outside the stadium is a reminder of what this is supposed to be about. They're not Muslims or Middle Easterns or politicians, they're just actually football fans in this scenario, celebrating like the rest of us would. Well, joining me now is political activist Ash Sarkar, who disagrees with everything I've just said. Good evening to you.
Good evening. Well, I only disagree with some of it, not all of it.
So, look, here's my problem. It's not that I think that Qatar has an exemplary record on human rights. They don't. My problem is once you put the human rights halo on about where you stage a World Cup, I'm not sure where you end up staging it. You can't have it in Africa. You can't have it in the Middle East. You can't have it in India. You can't have it in China. I'm not sure you could have it in America, given their draconian rules, for example, about abortion, which are very offensive to many other countries outside America. In other words, if you start to be too saintly about it, I'm not sure you can end up having a World Cup.
Well, I think if you take that logic too far, it means you end up drawing a line absolutely nowhere. And I think that both of us would agree that you draw a line somewhere, and what we're disputing is where you do it. Can I ask you a really quick question?
Sure.
Back in the 1980s, did you support the boycott of apartheid South Africa?
Yes.
Yes. And can you tell me why you supported that boycott?
Because I felt that apartheid South Africa was based on pure racism and discrimination. And you're going to say to me now, OK, what's the difference between that and the way Qatar treats gay people?
I'm not saying what's the difference. The thing I'm saying is that at that time in the 1980s, I mean, I was barely a twinkle in my father's eye at that point, but so my mother tells me, is that when you were outside of Barclays, encouraging Barclays, to divest from South Africa and for people not to bank with Barclays, or when you were saying, hang on, the cricket team or the rugby team or the football team shouldn't do sporting tours in South Africa, people would go, well, hang on, there's so many other countries with terrible human rights records. Why aren't you doing this about the Soviet Union? Why aren't you doing this about China? You can say, why aren't you doing this about this country for practically any human rights issue you care to name? So for me, there's a case for people to boycott Qatar if that's what they want to do. I also think if that's what people wanted to do, they should have started to organise it.
Well, I agree. Look, I don't disagree with you. I think if you feel that strongly about it, don't go to Qatar. And my problem is once they've got the World Cup, which they were awarded 12 years ago, once everybody's there, it's a football tournament. And I find the endless politics now is just getting in the way of what should be.
Did you support the Iranian players refusing to sing the national anthem?
Absolutely.
And using the press conference to shine a light on the conditions in Iran?
That, to me, is moral courage, because they're doing it to their own country. They're making a stand where there is genuine oppression of women in that country right now. That's fine. My problem is with England, who basically said, with the Football Association's backing, we're going to wear these... We're not going to boycott it. We're going to wear these armbands supporting the LGBT community, and then they get threatened with a yellow card and they all run a mile.
You are are not going to get me to disagree with you on that one, because I thought it was frankly comical.
Pathetic.
Right? You have got this Iranian team who are putting their careers and their freedom, potentially even their lives in danger to stand with the protesters.
I agree.
You've got the England team saying, OK, well, we're not going to back down on our values. And then suddenly it's like, oh, no, not a sporting punitive measure. I mean, it's totally cowardly.
Let me ask you a question.
So you're not going to get me to disagree with you there.
OK, so we reached some points of consensus, but where would you stage a World Cup? I mean, the World Cup's the biggest sporting event in the world. Where would you be happy to see it staged?
So the thing I would say is, rather than doing this pick and choose of countries, is how are the decisions made?
Well, name one.
Right, both me and...
Name one you'd be happy for it to be at.
Both me and you, I think, could probably agree that FIFA is such a corrupt organisation that there are cartels out there going steady on lads.
That's not my question.
And so the problem is that
I've asked you a simple question.
So hear me out. Throughout FIFA's history, because of that corruption, states which want to launder its image by having this proximity and association with sports have been able to do so. And it goes back way before Qatar. It goes way back before the Russian World Cup. It goes back to,
I think it's been corrupt since it started.
1978 World Cup. So I think that you deal with this by going, well, let's clean up FIFA.
Fine.
And then you can have some standards imposed. So you can go, okay, we're only going to do it in democracies.
Don't be like a politician. You're ignoring my question.
No, this is a real question.
Give me one place in the world you'd be happy to see the World Cup hosted.
Tottenham.
Well, you're a Tottenham fan, I forgot that. I mean, that's even more heinous than anything you've discussed so far. But seriously, where would you host it?
But for me, this isn't the point about going, these are good countries, these are bad countries.
But hang on, look,
my point is...
You're missing... I know your points. You made it very forcefully. My point is, could we actually legitimately host it in England, given this moral criteria? England took part in the illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003. That sparked nearly 2 decades of ISIS terrorism, never mind anything else, caused huge fury in the Middle East. We saw last year when we hosted the European Championships how disgusting our fans, many of them, behaved at the final at Wembley. I was there. They were snorting coke, boozing, brawling, breaking in with no tickets, spreading COVID.
Sounds like a great weekend.
It was disgusting to watch and dangerous and unpleasant. So my point is, who are we to actually lecture other countries about laws when we invade countries illegally? Who are we to lecture people about, for example, they say we can't drink beer inside stadiums when they've watched what happened at Wembley?
What you make here is a good point, which is that there is no country whose hands are clean. And I think there's a more important point here, which is that we can't expect football to do things that our government won't. When you look at the amount of Qatari money, which is sloshing around London, the Sovereign Wealth Fund buying up Harrods, buying up billions in property.
Why shouldn't they be allowed to buy Harrods?
I think what we're going to end up with is
why shouldn't they own Paris Saint-Germain football team?
So I think we're going to end up in the same position as we did with Russian money, which is when we allow regimes that we're dependent on for fossil fuels to then use our financial
We get 20% of our gas from Qatar, apparently. I heard on Newsnight last night.
I think it's 6% according to government documents, but...
So a large chunk of gas comes from Qatar. Would you turn that off in principle now, given the energy crisis in the country?
I would say so we don't have to buy fossil fuels from Saudi Arabia or Qatar or the UAE.
Would you turn off the gas then?
I would say is we need to develop an economy which isn't reliant on imported fossil fuels. And for decades we haven't done that. So this is my point, which is we have these huge expectations of football to take stances that our governments won't. If we don't want dirty money sloshing around the city of London, we need to tighten up our financial laws.
I agree.
If we don't want to be dependent on these countries, we need to focus on energy sovereignty.
I agree, but let me come back.
Greening our economy.
You have